900 miles east of the Philippines, a small island nation of roughly 20,000 people sits at the precise geometric center of America's most consequential military calculation in the Pacific, Palau. Most viewers have never heard of it. The Pentagon has been thinking about it for a decade. In 2025, U.S. Pacific Air Forces confirmed a terminal high-altitude area defense battery rotation to the Compact of Free Association States. The language was bureaucratic, the disclosure buried in a posture review appendix, and the press ignored it. But the planners who wrote that line knew exactly what they were saying. A THAAD battery on Palau does not defend Taiwan, it defends Guam, and the difference between those two sentences is the entire strategic logic of the second island chain. This video is the explanation that posture review appendix never provided. We are going to walk through the geometry, the legal framework that makes it possible, the missile math that makes it necessary, and the reason the choice was Palau and not any of the more obvious locations. By the end, the Pentagon's calculus will be readable as plainly as a map, because that is exactly what it is. Stay with this one. The architecture here is not simple, but it is precise, and precision is the point. To understand why this matters, you need to know what Guam actually is in the operational architecture of American power projection in the Pacific. Guam is not simply a U.S. territory. It is not simply a convenient airfield in a convenient location. Guam is, in the language of Indo-Pacific Command posture statements, the strategic hub of Western Pacific power projection. And that designation carries specific operational meaning that the word hub obscures more than it clarifies. Andersen Air Force Base on Guam is the only installation west of Hawaii where the United States can base and sustain heavy bomber operations without a treaty partner's permission. It is the location from which B-52 Stratofortresses and B-2 Spirit bombers have flown continuous bomber presence missions into the Western Pacific for years, projecting the credible threat of long-range strike without the forward basing that would require Philippine, Japanese, or Australian consent for each sortie. The B-21 Raider is now entering operational service, and its integration into the Andersen rotation schedule is understood to be a near-term planning priority for Pacific Air Forces. An airframe with greater stealth and comparable range to the B-2, operating from a location 2,900 kilometers from the Chinese coast, is a persistent strike threat that the PLA must plan around in every contingency scenario. The second function of Guam, in the operational architecture, is logistics and sustainment. Joint Region Marianas, the combined naval installation adjacent to Andersen, is capable of supporting carrier strike group operations, submarine maintenance, and the prepositioning of munition stocks that would be consumed at high rates in a sustained Pacific conflict. The Guam military buildup, underway since the 2011 base realignment and continuing with additional Marine Corps force structure relocated from Okinawa, is not a construction program. It is the physical articulation of a strategic decision. The United States is investing in Guam as a survivable operational base, not merely a peacetime presence location. The full significance of that designation requires understanding what contested means in the planning context. It does not mean damaged and degraded over time. It means targeted in the opening hours of a conflict by a strike package designed specifically to reduce operational capacity before U.S. forces can disperse and reposition. The PLA's anti-access and area denial doctrine, which Western analysts abbreviate as A2AD, was built around the assumption that degrading Andersen early in a conflict is the single most effective way to reduce U.S. power projection capacity in the Western Pacific. The logic runs as follows. B-52s and B-21 Raiders flying from Andersen can strike targets across the Western Pacific without forward staging. Suppressing Andersen suppresses that reach. Suppressing that reach changes the calculus for every U.S. partner in the region about whether American security guarantees are credible in the opening hours of a contingency before strategic reinforcement can arrive. The PLA does not need to destroy Andersen permanently. It needs to suppress its operational tempo long enough to accomplish objectives that become much harder to reverse once completed. That window in PLA planning doctrine derived from open-source PLA publications and from the published analysis of RAND Corporation and the Center for Strategic and International Studies is estimated at between 72 and 96 hours. The PLA's assessment, based on their modeling of U.S. reinforcement timelines from Hawaii and the continental United States, is that a conflict resolved within that window in China's favor is a conflict the United States cannot reverse without accepting costs that exceed the political threshold for continued military action. This is the operational logic the Palau THAAD site is designed to disrupt. Not by making Guam invulnerable, nothing makes a fixed installation invulnerable at the ranges and warhead yields the PLA can bring to bear. The goal is to make the opening strike package the PLA would need to suppress Andersen large enough, and observable enough that it cannot be launched without triggering the strategic warning that allows U.S. forces to begin dispersal before the first warheads arrive. The second island chain runs from Japan south through the Mariana Islands, through Guam, and down through the Caroline and Palau island groups toward Indonesia. It is not a military alliance, it is a geographic fact. A chain of terrain that sits on average between 1,800 and 2,500 miles from the Chinese coastline. That distance is the key variable in every Indo-Pacific threat calculus the United States runs. China's medium-range ballistic missile inventory, specifically the DF-21D and the DF-26, was designed to operate inside that distance. The DF-26, which PLA Rocket Force Doctrine has designated the Guam Express in unofficial communications that have surfaced in open-source analysis, carries a conventional or nuclear warhead to ranges between 3,000 and 4,000 kilometers. Guam sits at approximately 2,900 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. The DF-26 covers it with range to spare. A THAAD battery on Guam alone allows the PLA to plan for a strike package of calibrated size, one large enough to saturate the single battery's engagement capacity, but not so large that its launch signature generates unambiguous strategic warning at the moment the U.S. most needs time to respond. The addition of a Palau battery breaks that calculus. The PLA planner cannot know in advance of a conflict the exact engagement parameters of both batteries operating in a networked configuration. The uncertainty alone has planning value. The second value of the Palau site is physical intercept geometry, and this is where the missile math becomes concrete. A DF-26 fired from the Chinese interior on a trajectory to Guam reaches its peak altitude over the western Philippine Sea at a point that, depending on the specific launch location and trajectory, passes within the engagement envelope of a Palau-based THAAD battery. THAAD's engagement altitude range is publicly stated as between 40 and 150 kilometers. At the relevant phase of a DF-26 flight path, mid-course to early terminal, the warhead is within the upper portion of that altitude band. An intercept attempt at that phase, 900 miles from Guam, is an intercept attempt where a miss does not mean the warhead arrives at the target immediately. It means the warhead continues on a trajectory that brings it into the engagement envelope of the Guam battery approximately 4 to 6 minutes later. Two batteries, two intercept opportunities on the same warhead, separated by 900 miles and 4 to 6 minutes of flight time. That is the geometry. That is the entire argument for the Palau site, stated in operational terms. The PLA's answer requires either enough warheads to saturate both engagement envelopes simultaneously, which means a salvo roughly twice the size of what would be required against a single Guam battery, or it requires suppressing the Palau site before the main strike package launches. The first option is expensive in weapons, the second is expensive in time, and in strategic ambiguity. Here is where the compact of free association becomes the unacknowledged load-bearing element beneath every carrier deck operation, every MH-60 Seahawk sortie, and every radar scope running in the Western Pacific, the legal structure that keeps the runway open when alliance politics would otherwise shut it. Palau is not a U.S. territory. It is not a treaty ally in the Article 5 sense. It is a sovereign nation that has, since 1994, maintained a compact of free association with the United States under which the U.S. government holds exclusive authority to conduct military activities in Palauan territory and waters, and in exchange provides financial assistance, access to U.S. federal programs, and an explicit defense commitment under Section 321 of the compact. On the carrier's island superstructure, the flag still flies, but the legal architecture underneath it is what makes the runway below usable at all. The United States can station aircraft, run radar scopes, and conduct freedom of navigation patrols from this atoll without negotiating basing rights through a treaty ally's parliament. That distinction shapes every operational decision made on this flight deck. A THAAD battery on Palau does not require Senate ratification. It does not require the approval of the Philippine Senate, which has complicated U.S. access negotiations for the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites for 2 decades. It does not require the acquiescence of Japan's domestic political coalitions, which periodically constrain U.S. basing options in Okinawa. The compact framework gives the United States military access rights that are cleaner legally than almost any other basing arrangement it maintains anywhere in the Pacific. What it requires is the agreement of the Palauan government, which has been forthcoming, and the agreement of the Palauan people, whose president has made the strategic judgment that close U.S. alignment is the correct response to a regional environment dominated by a growing Chinese naval and economic presence. In 2023, Palau's President Surangel Whips Jr. traveled to Washington and addressed Congress on precisely this theme, making the case for the U.S.-Palau relationship in terms that reflected a sophisticated understanding of the strategic stakes. That speech was not a diplomatic formality. It was a political signal from a government that had made a clear choice about which side of the Indo-Pacific competition it intended to align with. The detail that does not appear in most analysis of this decision is the quiet but consistent engagement between Palauan leadership and senior U.S. defense officials over the past several years. Palau's president has been received at the Pentagon and at Pacific Command headquarters in ways that are not standard protocol for the leader of a nation of 20,000 people. The relationship has been cultivated deliberately and quietly, and the reason it has been quiet is that the Philippines has been watching. Manila's relationship with Washington has been the most complicated variable in Indo-Pacific basing for the better part of 2 decades. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites, of which the United States has identified 9 locations under the 2023 expansion, give the U.S. military rotational access to bases across Luzon and Palawan, but Philippine domestic politics and the specific dynamics of Chinese economic pressure on Manila have created persistent uncertainty about the conditions under which those sites would be available during a Taiwan contingency. That is not a criticism of the Philippines. It is what freedom of navigation patrol planning looks like when every partner faces the same geometry, economic ties pulling one direction, a carrier defense screen pulling the other. The Palauan calculation is different. Chinese economic leverage finds little purchase there, and Palauan leadership has already made its choice, visible in the fact that U.S. aircraft operate from its airstrips at all. The radar scope does not show you the doctrine behind the intercept. This channel does. Subscribe if you want the planning logic, not just the footage. Most people assume basing decisions in the Pacific are driven primarily by military requirements. The evidence in this case suggests a more complicated picture. Military geometry was the necessary condition for the Palau decision. It was not the sufficient condition. The sufficient condition was the combination of legal simplicity, political reliability, and geographic precision that Palau's specific situation provided. No other location in the Western Carolines or the Philippine Sea offered all 3 simultaneously. The Federated States of Micronesia, another compact state, sits further east and south, outside the optimal intercept geometry for DF-26 trajectories to Guam. The Northern Mariana Islands, a U.S. Commonwealth, would offer legal simplicity but at the cost of political exposure. Basing additional heavy missile defense on a U.S. Commonwealth creates domestic political dynamics that the current framework deliberately avoids. The EGA sites in the Philippines offer geographic proximity to the first island chain but carry the alliance management friction already described. Palau is, in the geometric and legal sense, precisely the right answer. It is also an answer that required years of patient diplomatic cultivation to make available. The historical parallel that Pentagon planners are drawing on, whether explicitly or through institutional memory, is the Cold War experience at Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, another compact of free association state. Kwajalein hosts the Reagan Test Site, the primary facility for U.S. ballistic missile defense testing and intercept evaluation. The infrastructure the United States built at Kwajalein during the Cold War and maintained through the THAAD developmental testing program in the 1990s and 2000s established both the technical and legal precedents for what is now being contemplated for Palau. Kwajalein's value was its distance and its clean legal status, far enough out across the open ocean horizon that no competitor could threaten it easily, and simple enough politically that the United States could build runways and operate submarines without navigating the alliance friction that complicates every decision in Japan, Korea, or the Philippines. Palau sits in the same position in the Western Carolines that Kwajalein holds in the Marshalls. The same open ocean expanse, the same freedom of navigation patrol corridors, but 900 miles closer to where an MH-60 Seahawk lifting off a carrier deck would actually need to fly to close an intercept. What the open-source planning documents and congressional testimony show, read carefully, is that the compact states appear on a different line of the ledger than treaty allies. Not a lesser line, a different one. Their value is precisely that an MH-60 can lift off, a radar scope can run, and a freedom of navigation patrol can depart without a treaty ally's cabinet vote intervening. The Cold War planners who built the Kwajalein infrastructure understood that. The current generation coordinating carrier deck operations across the Pacific appears to have reached the same conclusion about Palau, for reasons that are structurally identical, even if the aircraft on the flight deck are now F-35Bs instead of anything that flew in 1975. The debate within Pacific Command, and in the relevant congressional committees over the last several years, has not been about whether a Palau THAAD site would improve the defensive geometry. The physics is not contested. The debate has been about cost, operational footprint, the signal it sends to Beijing, and the domestic political sustainability of expanding U.S. military presence in the compact states. A THAAD battery rotation is not a trivial logistical undertaking. The system requires significant infrastructure, radar arrays, power generation, maintenance facilities, and the personnel to operate and sustain them. The cost of establishing that infrastructure on a remote Pacific island, with the supply chain challenges that entails, is substantially higher than maintaining an equivalent capability on a base with existing heavy infrastructure like Andersen. The congressional debate over this investment has proceeded largely in classified sessions, appropriate given the operational sensitivity of the specific geometry involved. What has surfaced in unclassified testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee and in the publicly released sections of the National Defense Authorization Act debate is a broad bipartisan consensus that the Guam defense architecture requires thickening, combined with persistent disagreement about the pace and the specific configuration. The Palau option has been on the table in those discussions for at least 3 years before the 2025 posture review confirmation. Here is the assessment that will generate disagreement, and we are comfortable with that. The delay cost the United States a window of relative ambiguity. A Palau THAAD site established in 2021 or 2022 would have been normalized by now, absorbed into the baseline Indo-Pacific posture that China plans around. A site established in 2025 or 2026 reads as a direct response to the specific threat escalation of the Taiwan Strait tension cycle, which means it carries a signaling cost that an earlier placement would not have incurred. The Pentagon made the right call. It made it late. What does this cost PLA planners in practical terms? The answer is measurable, and the measurement is in warheads. To saturate a single THAAD battery in a single engagement cycle requires, by publicly available analysis of THAAD's intercept capacity and reload timeline, a salvo of sufficient size to exceed the battery's engagement envelope before reload is complete. The exact numbers are sensitive, but the general parameters are discussed in open literature. A single battery can engage multiple simultaneous targets within its coverage area, with a finite magazine before reload. A two-battery architecture with one on Guam and one on Palau requires the PLA to roughly double the salvo size to saturate both simultaneously because the intercept geometry of the two sites creates overlapping but not identical engagement envelopes. The Aegis destroyers in the Philippine Sea add additional intercept capacity against some DF-26 trajectories. The F-35 staging through Andersen add an offensive deterrent that forces the PLA to account for strike packages launching from Guam even while attempting to suppress it. The integrated picture is a defensive architecture that is not impenetrable, but substantially more expensive to saturate than the single battery configuration it replaces, and the cost is in weapons that the PLA rocket force cannot cheaply or quickly produce in the additional quantities required. China's intermediate-range ballistic missile inventory is large. It is not unlimited. The warheads required to saturate an expanded Guam defense architecture are warheads not available for other targets. Would you put a THAAD battery on Palau, given what you now know about the geometry? That is not a rhetorical question. The strategic logic is clear. The question is whether the signaling cost of doing it is worth paying when the alternative is leaving Andersen inside a saturable envelope. Comment your read below. We track what this community actually thinks about these decisions. The B-52s continue to rotate through Andersen. The F-35 infrastructure expansion is on schedule. The Arleigh Burke destroyers of the Pacific Fleet run their Aegis patrols on timelines that are not public but are not invisible to commercial satellite imagery. The layered architecture is assembling, piece by piece, in a way that each individual announcement can be characterized as routine but that, seen together on a map, reads as a coherent design. Beijing reads maps. There is a detail in the 2025 posture review that deserved more attention than it received. The confirmation of THAAD rotation to the compact states was accompanied by a separate line item authorizing preliminary engineering assessments for persistent radar infrastructure at forward locations in the Western Pacific. That phrase, persistent radar infrastructure, is the bureaucratic encoding of a significant strategic commitment. THAAD functions as an integrated system. The ANITPY-2 radar that provides targeting data for THAAD interceptors is, in many respects, more strategically valuable than the interceptors themselves. The ANITPY-2 in forward-based mode, positioned on Palau, would provide tracking data on DF-26 launches from the Chinese interior at ranges and angles that substantially improve the overall engagement geometry for the entire network defense architecture. Data from that radar, fused with data from the Aegis-equipped destroyers and from the satellite-based sensors of the Space Force's strategic warning architecture, creates a tracking picture with earlier warning and more accurate trajectory prediction than any single sensor can provide. The interceptors that actually destroy the warhead are the visible component of the system. The radar is the component that makes the entire system work. A forward-deployed ANXTPY-2 on Palau, networked into the same kill chain as the Aegis destroyers and the Guam battery, is an intelligence asset as much as a fire control asset. It collects tracking data on every ballistic missile flight originating from Chinese territory that passes within its coverage area. In peacetime, that data informs the understanding of PLA rocket force tactics, deployment patterns, and test program progress that feeds into the annual threat assessments driving U.S. defense investment decisions. This is what the posture review language meant by persistent radar infrastructure. It was not describing a weapons system, it was describing an intelligence and battle management node that happens to be integrated with a weapons system. The PLA understands this. The response to a forward-deployed ANSATPY-2 on Palau is not just the response to a THAAD battery. It is the response to a sensor that degrades the ambiguity that Chinese strategic planners have historically relied on in the early phases of a contingency. Launching ballistic missiles at Guam, when a forward ANATPY-2 at Palau is tracking every round from the moment of ignition, is launching into a sensor environment that removes much of the tactical surprise that saturation attack relies on. The strategic logic of the Palau site, seen in full, is not just missile defense, it is sensor extension, it is intelligence collection, it is the thickening of the battle management architecture that connects dispersed U.S. forces into a coherent operational picture. The THAAD battery is the most visible piece of that architecture. It is not the most consequential one. The PLA rocket force's response to the thickening Guam defense architecture has not yet fully materialized in open-source reporting. There are indicators in procurement patterns and in the developmental testing signatures that commercial imagery analysts have documented at known Chinese missile test ranges that suggest work on higher-yield conventional warhead configurations and on maneuvering re-entry vehicle technology that complicates terminal phase intercept. Neither development is surprising. Both are consistent with the logic of an offense-defense competition that the Palau basing decision has now joined. The unresolved variable, and there is always one, is the Philippine Sea itself. The Aegis destroyers that provide the third layer of the Guam defense architecture operate in waters that sit between the first and second island chains, in a maritime environment where Chinese surface and subsurface presence has expanded steadily over the past decade. An Arleigh Burke destroyer, providing Aegis coverage for Guam, is a high-value target in its own right, and its survivability in the opening hours of a Pacific contingency is a planning assumption that Pacific Fleet has not fully answered in public. The THAAD battery on Palau does not solve that problem. It reduces the pressure on the Aegis layer by improving the overall intercept geometry, but it does not eliminate the destroyer vulnerability that sits at the center of the architecture. That question remains open. Pacific Fleet is working on it. The answer, when it comes, will probably look like another quiet announcement buried in another posture review appendix, in language as carefully calibrated as the 2025 line that most people did not read. One more thing that does not get said plainly in the official discourse: the Palau decision is not primarily about Palau. It is about demonstrating to every other compact state, every ETA partner, and every treaty ally in the Indo-Pacific that the United States is prepared to use the full range of its access frameworks to build the defense architecture the geometry requires. The signal is not just to Beijing, it is to Manila, to Tokyo, to Canberra. The message is that the United States will work with whoever is willing, on whatever legal framework is available, and that the second island chain will be defended whether or not every first island chain partner maintains perfect policy alignment at every moment. That is what the Pentagon chose Palau for, not because Palau was the most prominent option, because Palau was the correct one. Geography made the case, the compact made it legal, and the DF-26's flight path made it urgent. The board looks like this today. A THAAD battery, moving into the Western Carolines, a reinforced Andersen Air Force Base, Aegis destroyers on Philippine Sea Patrol, AUKUS submarines eventually adding subsurface depth to the architecture from the south. The geometry is assembling in the direction that second island chain math has always pointed. It is assembling at the pace that alliance politics and budget cycles permit, which is slower than planners would choose and faster than Beijing expected 5 years ago. The board favors the defense today. Offense-defense competitions do not stay static. The intercept advantage the Palau site creates will be pressured by the warhead and maneuvering vehicle developments now underway at Chinese test ranges. The timeline for that pressure becoming operationally significant is measured in years, not decades. The next layer of the architecture will need to be built before the current layer is degraded. Geography does not move. The advantage Palau's position provides in the intercept geometry is a permanent feature of the map, fixed as firmly as the second island chain itself. What is not permanent is the political will to maintain and expand the infrastructure that exploits it. That is the variable that cannot be solved by a posture review appendix. It is the variable that gets solved, or not, by a generation of strategic decisions that are still being made. Power is not what you can destroy. It is where you can stand and not be moved. Palau is where the United States chose to stand. The geometry explains why. The second island chain explains why it matters, and the DF-26's flight path explains why it could not wait.